David and Claire were city dwellers, used to bustling streets and the glow of skyscrapers. They'd decided to spend their Christmas somewhere quiet this year, away from the noise and stress of their usual lives. Frost Hollows seemed perfect, quaint, serene, and blanketed in a postcard-perfect layer of snow. The couple arrived on Christmas Eve, the last light of the day fading as their cars struggled up the icy roads. The village was small, its cottages lined with flickering candles in the windows. Snow fell gently, muffling the world in silence. As they checked into the only inn, the elderly innkeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, gave them a curious look. "You'll hear the bells tonight," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't go looking for them. Whatever you do, stay inside." David laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky local legend. Claire, however, felt a chill run down her spine. Something in the old woman's tone unsettled her. Midnight came, and as the couple sat by the fire in their cozy room, the first chime rang out. It wasn't the cheerful, bright sound of holiday bells. This was deeper, resonating, almost mournful. The sound seemed to echo through the entire village, carried on the biting wind. Claire looked up, her heart racing. "Do you hear that?" she asked, gripping David's arm. David nodded, his curiosity piqued. "It's probably just the wind hitting something metal," he said, though even he didn't believe his own words. The bells continued, their haunting melody calling out like a siren song. Unable to resist, David grabbed his coat. "I'm going to see where they're coming from," he said, ignoring Claire's protests. Reluctantly, Claire followed, her unease growing with every step. They stepped outside into the frigid night, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The village was eerily still, the windows of the cottages darkened. Only the sound of the bells guided them, pulling them toward the church in the center of the village. The church was a towering, ancient structure, its steeple leaning slightly to one side. The doors hung loosely on their hinges, swaying gently in the wind. David pushed them open, revealing a shadowy interior lit only by the moonlight streaming through broken stained glass windows. The bells were louder now, though the belfry above appeared empty. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, and their breath hung in the air like ghostly apparitions. As they ventured further in, Claire froze. "David," she whispered, pointing to the altar. There, a figure knelt, cloaked in a tattered robe. Its head was bowed, as though in prayer, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting its shape. The bells stopped suddenly, plunging the church into an oppressive silence. The figure turned its head, revealing a face pale as the snow outside, its hollow eyes gleaming faintly. A slow, chilling smile spread across its lips as it stood, its movements unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. David grabbed Claire's hand and they bolted for the doors. The figure's laughter rang out, echoing like the toll of the bells as it began to follow them. The doors slammed shut before they could reach them, trapping them inside. The temperature plummeted further, frost creeping along the walls and floor as the figure glided closer. Desperate, David grabbed a candelabra from a nearby pew and swung it at the figure. It passed through like smoke, and the figure laughed again, its hollow eyes fixed on Claire. "This place is cursed," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We need to get out." Suddenly, the bells began to ring again, their mournful toll filling the church. The sound seemed to disorient the figure, causing it to recoil. David seized the opportunity, grabbing Claire and pulling her toward a side door they hadn't noticed before. They burst outside, the frigid air hitting them like a wall. The bells grew fainter as they ran, their feet slipping on the icy ground. Behind them, the church loomed, its windows glowing faintly with an unearthly light. When they reached the inn, Mrs. Hargrove was waiting for them. Her expression was grim, her hands shaking as she bolted the door behind them. "I told you not to go," she said, her voice trembling. "The bells ring for the lost. They call to those who don't belong here. If you'd stayed any longer, you'd have never left." David and Claire sat in stunned silence as Mrs. Hargrove explained the village's dark secret. The church bells had been silent for decades until one Christmas Eve, a traveler had wandered in. That night, the bells rang for the first time, and the traveler was never seen again. Since then, every year the bells rang, calling out to those who were foolish enough to listen. The figure in the church was the first victim, trapped between worlds, forever bound to the cursed place. "You're lucky to have escaped," Mrs. Hargrove said. "But you must leave at dawn. The bells won't stop until they've claimed someone." It was supposed to be the perfect New Year's getaway. Lisa and her friends Mikhail, Karina, and Igor had rented a secluded cabin in the Norwegian wilderness, hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and spend a quiet holiday away from the world. The cabin was small, cozy, and surrounded by dense woods, far from any other human settlements. They arrived 2 days before New Year's Eve. The snow had been falling heavily since they arrived, blanketing the world outside in a thick layer of white. The wind howled through the trees, and the cold seeped through the walls, making the fire crackle in the hearth more desperately. At first, everything was perfect. The days were spent drinking mulled wine, playing board games, and enjoying the serene silence that only the deep wilderness could offer. But as night fell on the eve of New Year's Eve, something shifted in the air. The wind grew colder, and the snow outside began to fall even more heavily, swirling into strange, unnatural patterns. At first, Peter said nothing, and the audience stood too. At last, that night, after a hearty dinner and several rounds of drinks, the group retired to their rooms. The wind outside was deafening, making it nearly impossible to sleep. Lisa lay in her bed, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps in the snow outside the cabin. She got up and peeked through the window, but there was nothing. The snow had settled again, smooth and undisturbed. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself, and returned to bed. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The footsteps hadn't sounded like the wind. They had been too deliberate, too heavy. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke the silence. Lisa froze. It was an odd hour, past midnight. She could hear Karina's voice from the other side of the wall, but it was muffled, distant. "Who's knocking at this hour?" Mikhail asked, his voice slightly slurred from alcohol. The knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Maybe it's the wind," Igor muttered. But Karina went to the door and opened it anyway. A tall figure stood in the doorway, covered head to toe in snow. The man was nearly frozen, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been wandering in the snow for days. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I need shelter. The storm, it's coming for me." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know whether to trust him, but the man seemed desperate, and the cold night outside seemed even more unforgiving. They let him in. The man introduced himself as Henrik, a local who lived further up the mountain. He explained that his cabin had been destroyed by a sudden avalanche, and he had barely managed to escape. He had been walking for hours, hoping to find help. The group offered him a place by the fire, but something about his story didn't sit right with Lisa. The storm outside had been fierce, but the avalanche he described seemed too sudden, too unnatural. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Henrik's story. After a while, Henrik fell into a deep, uneasy sleep by the fire. The group was unsettled, but the warmth of the fire and the alcohol seemed to calm them for a moment. Then, the storm outside intensified again. The howling winds turned into something worse, something almost human. The sound was deafening, and the walls of the cabin began to shake. It felt as though the entire forest was alive, surrounding them. Irina suddenly stood up and walked to the window, her face going pale. "There's something out there," she whispered. Lisa walked over to her and they both stared out the window. Through the blinding snow, they saw figures, dark, shadowy forms moving in the trees. They were coming closer. Henrik's eyes glowed in the firelight, and he stood up suddenly, his movements jerky and inhuman. "Henrik?" Mikhail called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the door, his eyes fixed on the dark forest outside. "No, you can't go out there," Igor shouted, but Henrik ignored him, pushing the door open with unnatural strength. The cold air rushed in, freezing the room in seconds. Lisa screamed, but the others were frozen in place. They watched as Henrik walked into the storm, his body vanishing into the swirling snow. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room fell silent. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. A scream filled with agony, horror, and something even worse, a sense of predestined doom. The storm outside continued, but the figures in the woods were now visible. Dark, hunched shapes, their movements synchronized and slow. They were coming closer. It wasn't the storm that was coming for them. It was something far worse. The group turned in terror as Henrik's voice echoed from outside. "You shouldn't have let me in." The night turned to chaos. The shadowy figures in the woods were no longer just figures. They were people. Humans twisted by some ancient malevolent force, their faces frozen in twisted grins. They surrounded the cabin, scratching at the walls, their icy fingers reaching through cracks in the wood. Bisa, Mikhail, Karina, and Igor barricaded themselves inside, but the wind outside grew louder, the shadows outside pressing against the walls. The door suddenly burst open, and in the doorway stood Henrik, his face covered in ice, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You should have stayed inside." Henrik's voice was no longer his own. It was deeper, more monstrous. "You should have stayed inside." Before they could react, the figures outside surged into the cabin, their cold fingers grasping at them. Lisa screamed as they were dragged into the storm, one by one, their bodies freezing, their souls swallowed by the darkness. "This is death," finally said Chichinov. It was supposed to be a peaceful winter getaway. Anna, a young woman from the city, needed a break from the chaos of her life. She had booked a cabin in a remote village high in the Carpathians, where there were no distractions. Just her, the snow, and the silence. She arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun already beginning to dip behind the mountains. The village looked charming, almost frozen in time, with snow-covered roofs and smoke rising from chimneys. The air was crisp and cold, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. Her cabin was on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by trees and a thick blanket of snow. The road leading up to it was barely plowed, and she had to drive slowly, careful not to get stuck in the deep snow. After parking her car and lugging her bags inside, she made herself a cup of tea, hoping to relax after the long journey. But the longer she stayed, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the night settled in, Anna turned on the fire in the cabin's fireplace and wrapped herself in a warm blanket, trying to enjoy the solitude. There were no lights in the village, except the flickering glow from the windows of a few homes. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, swallowed by the deepening snow. She decided to explore the village the next morning, but for now she would take advantage of the quiet. But as she sat by the fire, she started hearing strange noises from outside. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it sounded like footsteps in the snow. Her heart began to race. Who could be out there? The village was isolated, and the road leading to the cabin was untraveled. She got up and peered through the window. The snow had started falling heavily again, and the world outside was shrouded in a soft white veil. But she saw nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the endless white. Shaking off the feeling of unease, Anna returned to the fire, but the noises continued, soft but deliberate, as though someone or something was walking just outside the cabin, circling it. The sound grew louder, coming closer. Suddenly, the door to the cabin creaked. Anna froze. She hadn't heard anyone approach, and the door was locked. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly moved toward the door. Story deep. But when she opened it, there was nothing there. Just a wall of snow and the relentless snowfall. She sighed, relieved, but the unsettling feeling lingered. She locked the door again, bolting it tightly. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but she didn't sleep well. The eerie feeling in the air remained, like a shadow watching from the dark corners of the room. The next day, Anna decided to venture into the village to get some supplies and see if there were any other tourists around. The village, though small, had a few shops and homes scattered along the main road. As she walked through the village, she noticed something strange. The streets were empty. No one was around, not a single person in sight. The houses were all dark, their windows covered in heavy curtains. There were no signs of life. She felt a chill run down her spine. The village appeared abandoned, yet she had passed a few houses on her way in. Had something happened here? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though there was no one around. Of course, she was able to lock herself in the house. Now, she was all alone. She made her way to the only open shop, a small market tucked away at the end of the village. The old man behind the counter barely looked up when she entered, but his eyes were sharp and cold. "You're alone?" he asked in a raspy voice. "Yes," Anna replied, trying to sound casual. "Just here for a few days. What's going on in the village? Why is it so quiet?" The old man stared at her for a moment before speaking. "Don't wander out at night," he warned, his voice low. "The snow falls, and something follows it." Anna felt her blood run cold. She wasn't sure if he was being serious or if it was some kind of local superstition, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. That evening, after returning to her cabin, Anna noticed something even more unsettling. The snow was no longer falling gently. It was coming down in thick, swirling sheets, as if the storm was being driven by something far beyond nature's reach. As night fell, she heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't just outside the cabin. They were inside, moving around the walls, pacing back and forth, deliberately, almost as if something was circling her. Terrified, Anna grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She propped herself against the door, resting her pert against the wood. She opened it cautiously, but there was nothing there. Then she heard it, the sound of breathing, slow and deep, coming from behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her eyes flicked to the window. In the reflection of the glass, she saw them. Figures standing in the snow, staring back at her. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but their eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. Anna stumbled back, falling to the floor. The figures outside began to move toward the cabin, their steps deliberate and slow. The cold air inside the cabin seemed to freeze, and Anna's breath turned to fog. She ran to the door and locked it, but the wind outside grew even stronger, and the figures didn't stop. They continued to press against the walls, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. They spoke of the snow, of the winter, and of something ancient. The shadows outside grew darker, and Anna realized with a horrifying clarity that she wasn't alone. The village wasn't abandoned. It was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for her. In the early hours of the morning, Anna could no longer hear the footsteps. The silence was oppressive. She knew something terrible had happened, something that couldn't be undone. She tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Her phone was useless in this remote place. She opened the window to try and escape, but before she could even take a step, a cold, icy hand grabbed her arm from behind. Anna screamed, but the voice that whispered in her ear wasn't human. "The snow never stops," it said. She turned, but the room was empty. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer, darker than the night outside. In the final moments, as she looked out the window, she saw the entire village, every building covered in snow, every street abandoned. The snow had stopped falling, but the figures remained, watching from the edges of the forest. She looked over at the small silver cat. The last thing she heard was the echoing whispers from the forest, thick, cold, and final. "You're part of the village now." It was a quiet Christmas Eve when Sarah and Ben arrived at the remote holiday camp nestled high in the snow-capped mountains. The camp, known for its rustic charm and festive spirit, was eerily silent. Most guests had gone home for the holidays, leaving behind a few souls who sought peace and solitude. The thick layer of snow on the ground muffled their footsteps as they unloaded their luggage. The camp had a reputation, stories of past guests speaking of strange happenings during the holiday season. But Sarah and Ben were just looking for a break, away from the noisy city, to unwind and enjoy the festive season. They entered their cabin, a cozy yet somewhat old-fashioned place. The scent of pine trees filled the air, and the flickering fire in the hearth cast eerie shadows on the walls. As the evening wore on, Sarah and Ben enjoyed a quiet dinner, the light from the fireplace dancing across the room. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was an odd time. Neither of them had been expecting visitors. When Sarah opened the door, she was greeted by an empty porch, save for a small, beautifully wrapped box sitting on the doorstep. The box was unmarked. No note, just a simple red ribbon tied around it. A chill ran through Sarah as she brought it inside, curiosity getting the better of her. Ben was reluctant, but watched as Sarah slowly untied the ribbon. Inside, she found a delicate snow globe. At first glance, it seemed harmless, even beautiful. The swirling snow inside, the quaint figure standing behind the church in the globe. "That doesn't belong there," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Ben tried to laugh it off, but an uncomfortable tension settled over them. That night, as they prepared to sleep, strange noises filled the cabin. It started with a soft scratching sound, as though something or someone was moving within the walls. Sarah dismissed it as the wind, but Ben, growing more anxious, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and the noises intensified. There was a loud bang, followed by footsteps on the creaky wooden floor. The room grew cold, and the lights flickered intermittently. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for her phone to call for help, but the screen went black. The only light in the room came from the flickering fire, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Suddenly, the door slammed open with a force that shook the room. Ben rushed to close it, but when he turned around, he froze. Standing in the doorway was a tall, dark figure, almost like a silhouette. The figure didn't move, just stood there, and then it vanished. The next morning, neither Sarah nor Ben could shake off the eerie feeling. They decided to investigate the source of the strange noises. As they rummaged through the old cabin, they discovered a photo album hidden under the bed. It was filled with pictures of past campers, but what caught their attention was a photo of the camp from years ago, right in front of their cabin. In the photo, they could see figures standing outside, their faces obscured, but the most unsettling part was the shadowy figure in the background. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. He turned the page to find another picture of the same place. But it wasn't from the past. It was a recent picture with both of them in it. Sarah and Ben stared at each other, wide-eyed. Neither of them had taken the photo. Who could have? The air grew heavier as the sun began to set again. A third knock at the door came, louder this time. With great reluctance, Sarah opened it. There was nothing outside, but another box sat on the porch, this one larger than the others. Inside was an antique hand mirror, tarnished with age. Etched into the mirror's frame were the words, "Look again." When Sarah held the mirror up, everything seemed normal at first, but as she stared into the reflection, she noticed something chilling. Her own reflection was not matching her movements. She turned her head to the left, and the reflection turned to the right. Then the reflection smiled. A twisted grin that didn't match her own expression. Ben grabbed the mirror out of her hand, but as he looked into it, he too saw the same thing. The reflection of the mirror seemed to come alive, twisting, bending, and moving independently. Terrified, Sarah and Ben decided to leave. But when they opened the door, they found the camp surrounded by an impenetrable fog. They couldn't see the path they had arrived by. The entire camp seemed swallowed up in the dense mist. The final twist hit them hard when they came across the camp's old caretaker. He greeted them with a calm smile that sent a shiver down their spines. "You've seen the gifts," he said softly. "It's too late now." He revealed the truth about the camp, a place where time and reality blended, where the spirits of past campers were bound by a curse. Every year, someone new was chosen to stay, forced to witness the horror, trapped in an endless cycle of terror. The gifts were a warning, a sign that they had become part of the camp's sinister past. As the caretaker's words sunk in, the world around them started to shift. The fog thickened and the camp twisted. The gifts were not just physical items, they were a binding, a mark. The cycle would repeat. Ben and Sarah realized with horror that they were now part of the camp's dark history, and their fate was sealed. The wind howled outside as Oliver and Jennifer made their way through the dense woods to the mansion. The house stood towering and dark against the dimming sky, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. It was exactly what they were looking for: seclusion, peace, and a break from the chaos of city life. They couldn't help but admire its crumbling grandeur, the high stone walls, the windows with their intricate glasswork. It felt like stepping back in time. They checked in with the caretaker, an old man who seemed more uncomfortable than welcoming. With a few muttered words, he handed them the keys and quickly left, muttering something about not staying out too late. As the sun set behind the mansion, they unpacked their bags and went inside. The air was thick with dust, and every step they took echoed in the hollow silence of the house. The first night in the mansion felt uneasy, but not particularly alarming. However, when the clock struck midnight, strange noises began to fill the house. They could hear footsteps from upstairs, faint but deliberate, as if someone was walking just out of reach. At first, they assumed it was the house settling, an old building with creaky floorboards, but the footsteps grew louder, as though someone or something was moving through the halls with purpose. As they tried to sleep, the sounds escalated. Doors that had been firmly shut earlier in the evening were now slightly ajar. Windows creaked open by themselves, and the temperature in their room dropped suddenly, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. Every movement in the house seemed amplified by the eerie silence of the night. Jennifer woke to find a shadow flickering by the doorway, but when she tried to call out, it vanished. The next morning, Jennifer discovered something that would change everything. While exploring the dusty library, she stumbled upon a collection of old letters hidden in a drawer. They were written in elegant yet shaky handwriting, their ink faded with age. The letters spoke of the mansion's previous inhabitants, an old family that had once lived there but mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The letters contained cryptic messages about unfinished business and the house's dark history. Jennifer showed the letters to Oliver, but neither of them could make sense of the cryptic messages. There was talk of things waiting in the dark and things that were never meant to leave. A cold shiver ran down their spines as they realized that something terrible had happened here, a tragedy that had been swept under the rug by the locals. That evening, as the wind picked up and rattled the windows, Jennifer was standing by one of the old mansion's tall windows, looking out over the sprawling grounds. The landscape was bathed in an eerie moonlight, the shadows of the trees casting long fingers across the yard. She froze when she noticed something. Movement across the window, a figure standing perfectly still in the distance, watching them. Jennifer's heart raced. She tried to get Oliver's attention, but when they both returned to the window, the figure was gone. They searched the grounds, but found no trace of anyone. Yet, the unease lingered. The house seemed to be alive, its walls holding secrets, and its shadows stretching longer each night. The strange occurrences became more frequent. Items would move on their own, doors would lock and unlock at random, and at night they would hear whispering voices, so faint they could barely make them out. Every time they tried to investigate, they were met with nothing. It was as though the house itself was playing tricks on them, keeping them on edge. One night, after hearing footsteps right outside their door, Jennifer opened it to find the hallway completely empty. But then, a gust of cold wind swept through the mansion, and the paintings on the walls began to sway as if alive. The sounds of whispering voices became clearer, and Jennifer's name was whispered faintly from down the hall. She tried to reach for Oliver, but he wasn't beside her. He had vanished. Panic set in as Jennifer searched for Oliver, but the house seemed endless. The halls twisted and turned in a maze, leading her to rooms she had never seen before, even though she was certain she had already passed them. Each time she opened a door, she found herself in the same room. The mansion had trapped them in its dark heart. When she finally found Oliver, he was standing motionless in the grand dining room, staring at a painting of the mansion's original family. Their eyes followed Jennifer as she moved closer to Oliver, and the figure of the patriarch in the painting seemed to shift, his eyes narrowing as though judging her. The whispering voices grew louder, now pleading for her to leave before it was too late. Together, they tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open. They were trapped, just like the family before them. The house had claimed them, and there was no escape. In the final moments, they realized the truth. The mansion didn't just keep people, it consumed them. Time twisted, and they became another part of its dark history, doomed to wander the halls forever. Sophia and her partner James were excited for their hiking trip. They had planned it for months, an adventure into the wilderness to escape the pressures of city life. Their goal was to find the fabled Forgotten Village, a place spoken of only in whispers by the few who knew about it. Some called it a myth, others a cursed place. But Sophia, intrigued by its mystery, was determined to find it. They set up early one morning, hiking through dense woods, following an old map James had found. The map had little more than a faded mark, indicating where the village should be. The deeper they ventured, the more the air grew heavy and thick with fog. The trees around them loomed taller, casting shadows that seemed to move with the wind. After hours of hiking, they came upon a clearing. And there it was, the village. At first, it seemed like any old place, with crumbling cottages and overgrown paths. But the silence in the air was unsettling. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It was as though the village had been frozen in time. As they ventured deeper into the village, they noticed the abandoned houses and deserted streets. There were remnants of lives once lived, children's toys scattered in yards, half-finished meals on tables. But there were no people. It was eerily quiet, no signs of recent life at all, yet it felt as though the village had been waiting for them. Sophia felt a strange sense of foreboding as they walked through the main street. The windows of the houses were dark, the doors hanging slightly ajar, but no one was inside. It was as if the entire village had been abandoned in haste. James tried to take photos, but the camera kept malfunctioning, the lens fogging over, and the pictures coming out blurry. They reached the village square, where an old stone fountain stood, its water long dried up. The buildings around the square seemed to loom over them, casting long, sharp shadows. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Just as they were about to leave the square, they heard a faint sound. A voice, barely audible, calling from one of the houses. James froze. The voice seemed distant, but it was unmistakable. They walked cautiously toward the source, finding a small, run-down house at the edge of the village. The door creaked open with a push. Inside, it was dark and musty. They stepped inside, and the air grew colder. In the corner of the room, an old woman sat in a rocking chair, her back to them. She didn't seem to acknowledge their presence, but the rocking motion continued, rhythmic and slow. Her clothes were ragged, and her hair hung loosely around her face. Sophia, feeling uneasy, approached her. The door creaked open with a push. Inside, it was dark and musty. They stepped inside, and the air grew colder. In the corner of the room, an old woman sat in a rocking chair, her back to them. She didn't seem to acknowledge their presence, but the rocking motion continued, rhythmic and slow. Her clothes were ragged and her hair hung loosely around her face. Sophia, feeling uneasy, approached her. Are you okay?" Sophia asked softly. The woman didn't respond, but the rocking stopped. After a long pause, she slowly turned to face them. Her eyes were vacant, hollow, and seemed to stare right through them. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice raspy and unsettling. "The village never lets anyone leave." Sophia and James backed away slowly, but before they could leave the house, the door slammed shut behind them. They tried to open it, but it was locked. Panic began to set in. They banged on the door, shouting for help, but the village remained eerily silent. The old woman's voice echoed through the house again, this time louder. "It's too late. You've seen too much. Now you belong to the village." The house felt colder now, the walls closing in on them. Sophia's breath came out in visible puffs, and her heart raced. They were trapped. The windows, once clear, were now covered in a thick layer of fog, and when they looked out, there was no sign of the village they had entered. Instead, it was as though they were floating in an endless void of fog and shadow. Desperate, they searched the house, finding old letters hidden in a drawer. The letters spoke of an ancient pact, a curse that bound the village and its inhabitants to an eternal cycle. Those who entered the village were trapped forever, unable to leave, their souls bound to the place. The villages had all made the pact years ago, offering their lives in exchange for protection from an ancient evil that lurked in the nearby forest. Realizing the truth, Sophia and James rushed to escape, but the house seemed to shift around them. Every turn led them back to the same room. The village was not a place. They were in a prison, and the village was alive. They could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the curse pressing down on them. As they approached the door one last time, the old woman appeared again, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. "You can never leave. The village will always find you." Sophia and James turned, running through the streets of the village, but the buildings began to dissolve into mist, the ground beneath their feet giving way to nothing. The village had no end, no exit. There was only the endless fog, and now the voices of the lost souls that had once lived there echoed around them. In the end, they too became part of the village, their figures fading into the mist, their cries lost in the endless void. It was the winter of 1987, a year of endless snowstorms and bitter cold. Emma, a young woman in her 20s, was tired of the same old New Year's parties, drinking, noise, and meaningless conversations. This year, she craved solitude. So when she came across an ad for a remote cabin in the woods, she saw it as the perfect way to escape the chaos of city life. The listing mentioned a small, cozy cabin nestled in the heart of a forest, completely isolated from the world, the perfect place to ring in the new year in peace. She arrived late on December 31st, the sun already long gone and the moon obscured by thick clouds. The cabin stood in eerie silence, surrounded by towering trees. Snow had begun to fall heavily, and the wind howled through the branches, creating an unsettling melody. But Emma didn't mind. She'd be alone here, just her and the quiet of the snow-covered wilderness. She unlocked the door, entering the cabin with a sigh of relief. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the cold air outside. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, and she smiled, feeling at home already. She set her bags down, poured herself a glass of wine, and decided to enjoy the evening by the fire, reading her book and watching the snowstorm rage outside. As the clock neared midnight, Emma felt the deep stillness of the cabin. The wind outside continued to howl, but everything within the cabin remained eerily calm. She watched the flames dance in the fireplace, her glass of wine almost empty. She leaned back in her chair, thinking about how quiet the world was. That's when she heard it, a faint scratching noise coming from the back of the cabin. She paused, her heart rate quickening. It was soft, but persistent, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. At first, she thought it might be an animal, maybe a mouse or something larger that had gotten inside. But it didn't sound like an animal. The noise was too deliberate, too methodical. Emma stood up and crept toward the back door where the noise was coming from. She hesitated before slowly reaching for the handle. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the scratching stopped. Silence. She opened the door cautiously, but there was nothing there, just an empty, snow-covered porch and the distant sound of the wind. Confused, she stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. She tried to shake off the unease, but something didn't feel right. The temperature seemed to drop sharply, and she noticed that the fire in the hearth was now barely glowing, as if the flames had been smothered by something invisible. The clock struck midnight, and Emma forced herself to focus on the moment. The new year had arrived, but as the seconds ticked by, the unease only grew. Added to that was the closeness of the buildings and the various smells that naturally attracted the vulnerable individual. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the front door. Emma jumped, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected any visitors, especially not at this time of night, and certainly not in this isolated place. Who could possibly be out there in the middle of a snowstorm? She didn't move at first, unsure whether she had heard it correctly. But then came another knock, louder this time, and the door rattled under the force of it. Reluctantly, Emma approached the door and peered through the small window beside it. Through the frost, she could barely make out a figure standing in the snow. It was a man, tall and cloaked in a heavy coat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could make out his faint outline in the dim light. "Hello?" Emma called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at her through the frosted window. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She had a strange feeling that he wasn't just some lost traveler seeking shelter. Something about him felt wrong. Without thinking, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound brave. "Cat!" The man didn't speak. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, revealing a face that was pale and hollow, with dark, sunken eyes. His lips were cracked and dry, and his skin looked as though it had been drained of life, almost decayed. He was gaunt, his hair wild and unkempt. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice raspy and weak, but with a strange, almost hypnotic quality. "It's so cold out here." Emma's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his voice, something compelling that made her want to invite him inside, even though every instinct in her screamed to slam the door shut and run. But she couldn't move. Her hand gripped the doorknob, frozen in place. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There was something in his voice, something compelling that made her want to invite him inside, even though every instinct in her screamed to slam the door shut and run. But she couldn't move. Her hand gripped the doorknob, frozen in place. "Please." The man's voice was soft, pleading, and Emma found herself slowly stepping back, allowing the door to open wider against her better judgment. "Me." As the man entered, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. A thick, unnatural cold filled the room, and Emma shivered violently. The man stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone who had not walked in years. He didn't look at her, but instead scanned the room with those hollow, black eyes, his head jerking as though he were listening to something. Emma backed away, still not sure what to do. Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Radley leaned closer, lifting a hand and tracing a blind pattern of his fingers on the paper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached out with a long, bony hand, and the moment his fingers brushed against her skin, she felt a jolt of icy terror surge through her. His touch was cold, colder than the snow outside. "You shouldn't have invited me in," he finally said, his voice low and filled with an eerie, unnatural echo. A sense of dread washed over Emma as the man's form seemed to twist and distort, as though his body was made of shadows. She took a step back, horrified, as his appearance began to change. His eyes grew larger, his face twisted into an expression of pain, and his mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. Before she could scream, the man lunged at her with a horrifying speed. She stumbled backward, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed with fear. His mouth was inches from her face when she suddenly managed to break free of her paralysis and run toward the back door. As she fumbled to open it, she heard the man's voice one last time, but this time it wasn't a plea. It was a growl, low and guttural. Too late. Emma ran into the snow, her heart hammering in her chest. The cold burned her skin, but she didn't care. She needed to get away, to escape whatever this thing was. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, through the thickening snow. But when she turned to look over her shoulder, she saw him standing in the doorway of the cabin. His eyes glowed now, and he was smiling, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. In the distance, the storm raged louder, but the figure didn't move. It was watching her, waiting for the inevitable. Emma's breath turned to mist, and with a final scream, she was swallowed by the darkness. Lena had always been fond of New Year's Eve. It was a time for reflection, celebration, and new beginnings. However, this year she felt a sense of unease creeping over her. She had just moved into a new apartment, a small but charming place that had once belonged to an elderly woman who had recently passed away. The apartment had been on the market for months, but when Lena saw it, she instantly felt a connection. It was perfect, just the right amount of space, cozy and a little quirky. A few days before New Year's Eve, Lena received a strange package at her door. It was an elegant box, wrapped in dark green paper, tied with a black ribbon. No return address. Inside, she found an ornate, antique mirror, small enough to hang on the wall, but large enough to catch a full reflection. It was framed with intricate designs, all done in a deep dark wood that seemed almost alive with movement when she stared at it too long. There was a note, handwritten in delicate cursive. "May this mirror reflect your future in the way you need to see it. Happy New Year." Lena was perplexed. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and she hadn't ordered anything like this. Still, the mirror intrigued her. She decided to hang it on the wall next to her entryway. It felt odd, but in a way that only made her more curious. As the night of December 31st approached, Lena decided to host a small, intimate celebration. She wasn't in the mood for a big party, so she invited just a few close friends. The apartment was warmly lit, and the small tree in the corner twinkled with lights. The scent of cinnamon candles filled the air, and the sound of distant fireworks reached her ears. As the evening wore on, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the guests nor the holiday cheer, they were all wonderful, but something in the air felt off. She caught herself glancing at the mirror occasionally, though she couldn't pinpoint why. It felt like the glass was pulling her in, just beyond her peripheral vision. At one point, as she stood by the kitchen, Lena noticed that the reflection in the mirror seemed different. The room in the reflection appeared darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, though the actual room was well lit. The reflection of the party guests looked slightly out of sync with reality, moving a fraction of a second too slow or too fast, their expressions unreadable. It was as though they were part of a dream. She shrugged it off as the wine getting to her head, but she couldn't ignore the growing discomfort in her stomach. She tried to push it away, engaging in conversation, but the mirror continued to draw her attention. Each time she looked at it, the more unsettled she became. As the clock inched closer to midnight, Lena's guests gathered around the TV to watch the countdown. The excitement in the room was palpable, but Lena couldn't stop staring at the mirror. It seemed to glow with an unnatural light, its surface shimmering, even though the lights in the apartment were dimmed. The clock struck 11:58, and Lena stepped away from her friends to look at herself in the mirror one last time. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong. Her image seemed to be smiling at her. A grin, wide and unnatural, stretched across her reflection's face. But Lena's own lips weren't moving. She froze, her heart pounding. She blinked, and the smile disappeared, replaced by a blank, almost expressionless face. A chill ran down her spine. There was no denying it now. Something was wrong with the mirror. She stepped closer, but as she did, her reflection didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Just as the clock struck midnight, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the only illumination came from the streetlights outside, casting eerie shadows through the window. Lena could hear the distant sound of fireworks and the cheers of her friends, but everything felt distant, disconnected. Lena fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight, but as she illuminated the room, she realized with a growing sense of dread that something had changed. Her reflection was no longer simply a reflection. It was alive. It moved on its own, independent of her movements. The grin from before had returned, twisted and malevolent. It wasn't just the reflection that scared her. In the mirror, there were now dark figures standing behind her, shadowy, indistinct shapes, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were motionless at first, but then they started to move, slowly creeping toward her. "Lena," a voice whispered from the mirror. It was a low, guttural sound, unlike any human voice. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one behind her. "Lena." The voice came again, but this time it was much clearer, and it came from within the mirror, as if the reflection itself was speaking to her. Grace's hands clenched, and she felt herself beginning to shake. Lena's hands shook as she backed away from the mirror. Her guests had gone silent, their laughter replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. She turned toward them, but they weren't looking at her. They were staring at the mirror, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Lena's throat went dry. The people in the mirror were not her guests. They were distorted, their faces stretched in horrifying ways. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. Their eyes, however, had become visibly wider. And then, one by one, her guests started to move. They stepped toward the mirror, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were under a spell. Lena reached out to stop them, but they didn't respond. They simply kept walking, drawn to the mirror as if it were calling them. The last thing Lena saw in the mirror was her own reflection, now grinning with those same dark, hollow eyes. As the shadowy figures surrounded her, she reached out, but the glass was cold, colder than the deepest winter night. Her hand pressed against it, but it didn't stop her friends from stepping into the mirror. And then, as the final stroke of midnight rang out, the mirror shattered. The room was silent. The lights flickered back on. The apartment was empty, completely empty. Her friends were gone. The mirror, once ornate and beautiful, now lay in pieces on the floor. Lena's heart raced as she slowly turned around. There, in the corner of the room, was the reflection of the empty apartment, still intact, but with one chilling difference. In the reflection, there was a figure standing in the doorway. It was Lena herself, but she wasn't smiling. Instead, she was staring back at her with the same hollow eyes, her face twisted into a grotesque, wide grin. And then in the reflection, she whispered, "Happy New Year, Lena." Lena had never been fond of the old church in the center of the village. It was too quiet, too cold, and the atmosphere inside always felt heavy. It had been years since anyone had really gone inside. The church's bells, once ringing with life, had stopped years ago. The old bell tower had grown silent, its massive bell left abandoned in the shadows, untouched and forgotten. This year, however, something was different. Lena had grown up in the village, but she had recently returned after living in the city for several years. It was New Year's Eve, and she wanted to reconnect with her roots, hoping to find the warmth and familiarity she remembered from her childhood. The village was preparing for the New Year's celebration, and the church was at the center of the village's traditions.
As night fell, the villagers gathered in the square, lighting bonfires and preparing for a midnight feast. But Lena noticed something strange. The church bell tower, despite being silent for as long as anyone could remember, now stood eerily still, casting a long shadow over the square. At the stroke of midnight, the bell would usually ring, signaling the start of the new year. But there was something unsettling about the silence that now hung in the air. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong.
As the clock neared midnight, Lena made her way toward the church, hoping to get a glimpse of the bell tower. She had always been drawn to the old building, fascinated by the history that seemed to haunt its walls. She walked through the snow-covered streets, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick snow. As she approached the church, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, looking out into the village square. The man was tall and thin, with a weathered face and dark eyes that seemed to pierce the night. He wore a long coat that seemed to blend into the shadows, and his presence felt unnervingly out of place. Lena hesitated for a moment, but then, drawn by an inexplicable force, she stepped forward and spoke. "Excuse me, are you okay?" she asked. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly, as if the movement was deliberate, as if he had been waiting for her. His gaze was cold and lifeless. "I'm waiting," he said in a low, raspy voice. For the bells. Lena frowned. The bells hadn't rung in years. What do you mean, the bells? She asked, her voice faltering slightly. The bells, the man repeated, his voice becoming more intense. They will ring again tonight. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard the legends, the stories passed down from generation to generation about the bell tower. It was said that the bells were cursed, that they had once been used in rituals long forgotten by time. The villagers stopped using the bells after a series of mysterious disappearances years ago, and the church had remained untouched ever since. But tonight something was different. The man seemed so sure, so certain. He turned his gaze back toward the church and began to walk inside, vanishing into the shadows. Lena stood frozen for a moment, her breath visible in the cold night air. Despite her better judgment, she followed the man into the church, drawn by a mix of curiosity and dread. The doors creaked as they opened, and the smell of aged wood and dust filled her nostrils. The inside of the church was dimly lit by candles placed along the pews. The stone walls seemed to groan under the weight of time, and the atmosphere was thick with an unsettling energy. In the center of the church, the bell tower loomed above, its dark silhouette casting a shadow over the altar. Lena looked around, but the man was nowhere to be seen. The church was silent, save for the distant sound of the wind outside. She hesitated, unsure of what to do next, when a sudden sound echoed through the air, a low rumbling growl, like a distant thunderstorm. The bell tower. For the first time in years, the bell began to ring. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonating tone that seemed to reverberate in Lena's very bones. The bell rang once, twice, 3 times, each strike louder and more powerful than the last. Lena's heart raced in her chest as the ringing continued, drowning out all other sounds. And then, something strange happened. The church doors slammed shut behind her, and the candles flickered violently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped, and Lena could see her breath in the air. Her legs felt heavy, as if something was pulling her down, making it hard to move. From the shadows, she heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered. "Now you're part of the bell's toll. The ringing never stops once it's begun." Lena turned toward the altar, her eyes wide with terror. And there, standing at the foot of the stairs leading to the bell tower, was the man. His eyes were now wide and unblinking, filled with something dark, something ancient. His face had twisted into a grotesque smile. As the bell continued to ring, the air grew thick with dread. Shadows began to stretch across the floor, moving like liquid, swirling around Lena's feet, pulling her toward the altar. The man stepped forward, his feet silent on the stone floor. "You were always meant to return," he said, his voice now filled with a strange, unsettling glee. "The bell calls to those who have forgotten. It calls to those who have been marked." Lena tried to scream, but no sound came out. She struggled, but the shadows around her tightened, pulling her toward the man, toward the bell tower. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Lena found herself standing at the foot of the bell tower, her legs trembling, her breath shallow. But then, something caught her eye. A figure standing at the top of the bell tower. It was the man, or something like him. His eyes were empty. his body distorted and inhuman, like a twisted reflection in a cracked mirror, and in his hands he held the bell's clapper, the one thing that had been lost for years. It felt like staring into the beacon of a lost heart, a figure that had been lost for years. The man's lips moved, but Lena couldn't hear what he said. His form seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving behind only the chilling echo of the bell. And then, the doors to the church opened, as if the night had reset itself, ready to begin again. The next morning, the village was still covered in snow, the sky blanketed by a layer of soft clouds. The villagers awoke, stretching their limbs and greeting the new year with cheer. Yet, when they looked toward the church, they saw something strange. The bell tower was silent, but the church doors remained wide open, as if inviting anyone who dared enter. And in the distance, they could hear the faintest ringing of bells, echoing through the mountains, as if the sound was carried by the very wind itself. The bell had rung again, but this time no one would ever dare ask who or what had answered its call. "I see attendant." The doors of the supermarket groaned as they slid open, letting in a blast of icy December air. Nate shivered, stepping into the harsh, fluorescent light. His breath clouded in front of him, even inside. The store felt wrong. The air carried a strange stillness, as if the world outside had stopped moving. He glanced around. A handful of tired shoppers wandered the aisles, their faces pale under the flickering lights. It was Christmas Eve, nearly midnight, and the shelves were half empty, picked clean by the holiday rush. But Nate wasn't here for holiday cheer. He was here for milk, a simple errand his roommate Kyle had insisted on before their annual tradition of marathoning old Christmas movies. As Nate reached for a basket, a voice interrupted. "You shouldn't be here this late," muttered the elderly cashier, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up, her gnarled fingers methodically arranging receipts. Nate forced a smile, just grabbing one thing. She didn't respond, her hands trembling slightly as she continued her task. The store felt larger than usual. Each aisle stretched impossibly long, the shelves looming over him. Nate grabbed the milk quickly, but hesitated by the freezer section, tempted by a pack of peppermint ice cream. That's when he noticed the man. At first, Nate thought he was just another shopper. The man stood at the far end of the aisle, facing away, his shoulders stiff. He wore a tattered coat that looked soaked, as if he'd walked through a blizzard. Nate felt a chill. The man wasn't moving. He just stood there, unnaturally still, his breath not visible in the cold air. "Hey, you good?" Nate called, forcing a casual tone. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly tilted his head, an almost imperceptible motion, as though he had heard Nate but chose not to acknowledge him. A faint, wet scraping sound echoed as he moved. Nate's stomach tightened. He backed away, the milk and ice cream forgotten, and hurried toward the checkout line. The cashier was gone. Nate's heart raced as he scanned the store for any staff. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting unsettling shadows across the tiled floor. He reached the self-checkout machines and swiped his items through quickly, his hands trembling. The receipt printed with a sharp click, but when Nate looked down, it wasn't his receipt. The paper was blank, save for one word scrawled in jagged red ink. The workouts were on a shelf. A chill ran down his spine. He spun around, clutching his bag tightly. The store was empty. The shoppers, the strange man, the cashier, all gone. Only silence remained. broken by the faint hum of the light. Nate bolted for the exit. As he pushed through the doors, the icy wind hit him like a wall. The streets outside were unnaturally quiet, even for Christmas Eve. The snow beneath his boots crunched loudly, almost deafening in the oppressive silence. Halfway home, Nate began to notice the footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching softly behind him. He stopped, turning to look. But the street was empty. Only fresh snow stretched out under the dim glow of the streetlights. He started walking again, faster this time, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The footsteps returned, heavier now, dragging slightly, as though whatever was following him was struggling to keep up. He turned again. This time, there were tracks. They weren't human. Long, deep grooves in the snow, as if something massive and clawed was crawling after him. Nate broke into a run, his boots slipping on the icy pavement. The footsteps quickened, keeping pace. He didn't dare look back again. By the time Nate reached his apartment building, his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He fumbled with his keys, throwing frantic glances over his shoulder. The tracks were still there, etched deep into the snow, stopping just a few feet from the building's entrance. Inside, the warm air felt suffocating. He slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the frame as he tried to catch his breath. The silence inside was almost worse than the noise outside. "Kyle?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response. Nate stepped into the living room. The lights were off, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. The Christmas tree was toppled over, its ornaments shattered across the floor. And there, in the middle of the room, was a single wet footprint. Not a boot print, but something far larger, with elongated toes and deep claw marks. Christmas Eve was supposed to be magical. For Sean Mitchell, it was anything but. A sudden craving for hot cocoa sent him trudging through the store to the only store still open, Martingale's Market, a quaint, family-run convenience store nestled at the edge of their small, sleepy town. The clock was nearing 11 p.m., and the store's old neon sign flickered weakly against the icy wind. Sean tightened his scarf and pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly. The store felt emptier than usual, even though a couple of shoppers wandered the aisles. Something about the air inside was unnerving. Too quiet, too still. The clerk behind the counter, a wiry man with a balding head, gave Sean a fleeting glance. "Close in 10 minutes, he muttered. Sean nodded, grabbing a basket. He didn't need much, just some cocoa, marshmallows, and maybe a snack or two. Oh. Building tension, the stranger in aisle 4. As Sean turned into the snacks aisle, he felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. A woman stood a few feet away, her back turned. She wore a long coat, its hem brushing the floor. Something about her was off. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical as she picked up a can of soup, inspected it, and then placed it back on the shelf. John shrugged it off, assuming she was just another tired shopper. But when he moved to the next aisle, she appeared there too, standing eerily still at the far end, her face obscured by the shadow of her hood. "Excuse me," he said, trying to step around her. She didn't respond. Her head turned slightly, just enough for Sean to glimpse pale, sallow skin and lifeless eyes that didn't quite focus on him. He stumbled back, muttering an apology, and hurried to the counter. The clerk looked up, his face pale. "You ready to check out?" Yeah," Sean said, his voice tight. "Who's that woman?" The clerk blinked, confused. "What woman?" Sean turned to point her out, but the aisle was empty. The last of the other shoppers had left, and Sean suddenly realized he was alone in the store with the clerk. "I just saw," he began, but the clerk cut him off. "We're closing." His tone was sharper now, more urgent. "You need to leave." Sean frowned but complied, grabbing his bag of items. The sense of unease grew as he stepped outside into the frigid night. The walk home should have been uneventful, but Sean couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. He turned back once, twice, 3 times, but the empty streets stretched behind him, bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. That's when he saw them, footprints in the snow. They appeared about 10 feet behind him, one after another, as if some invisible force was taking deliberate, measured steps. His breath quickened. He walked faster. The prints kept pace. He turned on the TV for background noise, flipping aimlessly through channels. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a movement, a flicker of motion outside his window. His heart sank. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. He approached the window cautiously, peeking through the curtain. A face stared back at him, pale, hollow-eyed, and impossibly still. Sean stumbled backward with a shout, but when he looked again, the face was gone, leaving only a faint smear of condensation on the glass. Sean spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment on, clutching a kitchen knife. He didn't sleep. By morning, he finally worked up the nerve to step outside. The street was bustling with Christmas cheer, the events of the night before seeming like a fever dream. But as he reached for his car door, he froze. There, in the snow, were footprints. They circled his car, stopping just at his driver's side door. And in the center of his windshield, scrawled in frost, were 2 words. "See you." Sean's breath hitched, and he turned wildly, scanning the street. The woman from the store stood across the road, staring at him with those same lifeless eyes. Slowly, she raised a hand, pointing toward him, and smiled. That was the last time anyone saw Sean Mitchell. His apartment was found untouched, his Christmas decorations still twinkling cheerfully. The only clue to his disappearance? A trail of footprints leading away from his building, vanishing into the snowy woods. The snow was thick, silent, and swallowed the sound of footsteps in the dead of night. Leah stood at the foot of her childhood home, the one she had left behind years ago. A small flicker of light from the upstairs window illuminated the otherwise dark, empty street. It called to her, beckoning her back, though every instinct screamed against it. She had never planned to return. Yet, when her estranged mother sent the letter, the one that arrived days before Christmas, it had pulled her back like a dark gravity. The words in the letter were simple: "Come home. It's time to face the past." Leah hesitated. She thought of her mother, long lost in some kind of dementia, trapped in a world that wasn't real anymore. But this wasn't the past she was worried about. It was the night that still haunted her dreams, the night she left, and the things she left behind. Inside, the house was cold, far colder than the winter chill outside. Leah pushed open the door with a reluctant shove, the familiar scent of dust and decay hitting her immediately. She didn't even need to turn on the lights. She could feel it. This place, as old as it was, hadn't changed. It was as if the house itself had frozen in time, a snapshot of all the moments she'd tried to bury. Her footsteps echoed through the hall as she moved past the family portraits, her father's face twisted into a permanent frown, her mother's eyes hollow, as if they knew something she didn't. They had known. And Leah hadn't been able to ask. She reached the staircase. From the top came a faint sound, a low creak, as if something, or someone, was waiting. She forced herself to climb, subjecting herself to a painful, slow-down climb into the new building, and as the daylight dimmed, at the top she found her mother's room. It looked as if no one had been inside for years, save for the things left behind: a half-finished cup of tea, a chair turned at an odd angle. But the most jarring thing was the diary on the floor, open to a page that read, "Tonight will be the night she comes back." Leah felt a chill creep up her spine. She couldn't explain it. It was just a diary, a collection of fleeting thoughts, but this entry seemed different. It seemed prophetic. Her mother was in bed, her frail body barely covered by a thin sheet, the room around her dark but for the soft light of the fireplace. The bed had been untouched in months, but her mother sat upright, her back arched at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide open, unblinking. "Mom?" Leah whispered, stepping into the room. Her mother's lips curled into an unsettling smile. "You've come back." Leah's heart hammered. "What do you mean?" You should have never left," her mother croaked. "They've been waiting for you." Leah froze, feeling the air grow heavy, oppressive. The words hung in the air like a curse, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She turned to the window, catching a glimpse of something moving in the snow outside. Too fast, too strange. It was gone before she could comprehend it. The floorboards groaned behind her, and when she turned back, her mother was standing. There was no mistaking the change. Her eyes were no longer just vacant. They were filled with something else. Leah didn't have time to ask. Her mother lunged forward, her frail hands gripping Leah's shoulders with an iron strength. "Yeah, I suspect that they are not mere brains, but live and die." Leah's heart stopped. She shoved her mother away, stumbling back as her head collided with the wall. For a moment, everything went black. When Leah opened her eyes, the room was different. The warmth of the fire was gone. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. And then she saw them. Up, a figure, cloaked in shadow, stood at the doorway, tall and impossibly still. It was not human, at least not entirely. Its face was a void, an endless abyss that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Leah felt the suffocating grip of fear, but something inside of her, something she didn't understand, forced her to stand. You're not real," she muttered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Maybe he was," she said, reaching for a purse and capturing her vial. But what did it matter? What was? What was it that mattered? The figure didn't speak, but Leah could hear its voice in her mind, like 1,000 whispers crowding her thoughts. "We were always real. You just didn't know it." She took a step back. "What do you want from me?" The figure reached up, its long, thin fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. "It's not what we want, it's what you need," snapped the director. In that moment, everything became clear. The memories flooded back. The ritual her mother had tried to forget, the strange disappearance of her father, the inexplicable deaths that had plagued the town for years, and the figures that had followed her, from her childhood dreams to her waking nightmares. Leah realized the truth at once. This place, her family, her past, had been built on a lie. The house was not merely a home. It was a gateway, a prison. And the figures outside weren't waiting for her to come back. They were waiting for her to set them free. Her mind reeled. She couldn't escape this. She couldn't outrun the truth that had been buried for so long. Her mother's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts, whispering urgently, "You have to stop them. They'll come for everyone if you don't." Leah turned back to the figure, now standing in the center of the room. "How do I stop them?" The figure tilted its head, an unnerving gesture. "It's too late. The snow has already begun." As if on cue, the room filled with a biting cold. The wind howled louder, and the shadow figure stretched its arms, revealing 1,000 twisting, writhing faces beneath its hood. They all stared at her with eyes full of accusation. Leah had no choice but to act. She grabbed the diary from the floor, her fingers trembling. Without thinking, she threw it into the fire, watching as the pages burned away. But nothing happened. The figure stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement. Leah's skin prickled, and in a final moment of clarity, she understood. It was never about stopping them. It was about joining them. She tried to speak, but only a croak escaped. "Etta uttered a break." The figure reached out, its hand grazing her cheek. She felt herself surrender, her vision blurring as everything around her faded to white. "Please, be safe now." The next morning, the snow was still falling. Leah stood outside, her feet sinking into the drifts of untouched powder. She looked at the house behind her, the once familiar building now a distant memory. And yet, as she walked away, a faint whisper echoed in her mind. "We'll be waiting." It was only then that Leah realized she had never truly escaped. She was now one of them, the ones who waited for those brave enough to face the past, the ones who never left. The snow continued to fall, as silent as the darkness that waited for its next victim. Mike and Emily, a young couple, decided to spend Christmas away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Mike came up with the idea of renting a room at an old mountain inn he had read about in a travel blog. The perfect place to enjoy the snow and peace, he assured her. They arrived late in the evening. The old inn looked majestic, but slightly eerie. Lights shone faintly through the curtains, and the tall pines surrounding the building seemed to guard it. Mr. Harper showed them to their room on the second floor. The centerpiece was a grand fireplace, adorned with intricate wooden carvings. On the mantelpiece sat an unusual angel figurine, so lifelike it seemed almost alive. "This is our family heirloom," Mrs. Harper said. "Every Christmas, the angel protects our home. Please don't touch it." Mike and Emily exchanged amused smiles, brushing it off as a local legend. Yet once alone in their room, they couldn't shake the feeling that the figurine was watching them. The first night was restless. Around 2 a.m., Emily woke up to a strange sound, like faint tapping. She shook Mike awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mike got up, but found nothing. The noise stopped. The next morning, they mentioned the sound to Mr. Harper over breakfast. His demeanor turned cold as he replied, "The angel has its rules. You do well to follow them." Mike picked it up and placed it back, but for a moment, he thought its expression had changed. He dismissed it, thinking it was just the flickering firelight. "How did it get here?" Emily's voice quavered. They placed the angel back on the mantelpiece. But things only got worse. The lights in the room began to flicker. The footsteps now echoed inside the room. Emily tried to stay calm, but her nerves were fraying. She suggested they leave, but Mike decided to go downstairs to talk to the Harpers. As he reached the first floor, he noticed the door to the sitting room was closed. Muffled voices came from inside, as though the innkeepers were arguing. He leaned closer and heard fragments of their conversation. "They shouldn't have touched it. This is their mistake, not ours." When Mike returned to their room, he found Emily sitting on the bed, pale and trembling. "It moved," she whispered. "What moved?" "The angel. I saw it turn its head." Mike tried to reassure her, but then they both heard a knock at the window. They were on the second floor. It was impossible. Mike looked out and saw a shadow in the snow below, faint but unmistakably shaped like wings. He decided they couldn't stay any longer and began packing their things. As they tried to leave the room, the door wouldn't budge. The angel figurine now lay on the floor again, its face twisted into a grotesque snarl. Emily screamed as the room went pitch black. In the darkness, a whisper echoed, "You shouldn't have touched it." Somehow, they managed to force the door open and fled outside. They jumped into their car and drove away without looking back. At the nearest gas station, they stopped to catch their breath. Mike opened the trunk to check their bags, but there it was, the angel figurine, lying on top of their belongings. The story ends with the sound of shattering glass and a scream, leaving the audience in suspense with an open-ended finale. Christmas at Jacob's grandmother's house had always been a bit strange. The old house stood at the edge of a forest, far from neighbors and the sounds of civilization. Only the wind, the trees, and the creaking walls kept them company. Even though his grandmother had passed away years ago, the family still visited the house for the holidays. This time, Jakob's mother decided to clean the attic to find some vintage decorations for the tree. Jacob went up to the attic with her. Among the dusty boxes, they discovered a wooden chest with a lock. Inside were decorations, glass balls, miniature angels, and a strange wooden soldier. The soldier was unusual. Its eyes glowed as if alive, and its wide smile seemed unnervingly sinister, like it was hiding something frightening. Jacob took the soldier to his room. That night, he placed it on a shelf and went to sleep. But in the morning, he found the toy on his desk next to a notepad with crooked lines drawn across its pages. Jacob asked his parents if they had touched the toy, but they just laughed. "You probably forgot where you put it." That night, he put the soldier back on the shelf, but woke up to strange rustling sounds. Turning around, he saw the toy now sitting on the windowsill, facing the forest. Jacob decided to hide the soldier. He placed it in a box and locked it in the closet. But the next morning, it was back on the windowsill, and outside in the snow were tiny footprints like those of a small human. His parents started noticing odd occurrences too. His mom heard someone whispering her name in the middle of the night. His dad found that the Christmas ornaments had disappeared from the tree and were stacked in a circle in another corner of the room. Jacob began having nightmares. In one, he was trapped in a dark room surrounded by shadows. In the center stood the soldier, its face now grotesquely twisted. "You must listen to me," it said in a deep voice. Jacob told his parents about his dreams. His father decided to throw the toy into the fireplace, but as they approached the fire, the soldier suddenly spoke. "You cannot get rid of me." The flames instantly extinguished and the house plunged into darkness. After a few moments of silence, they heard a scraping noise outside the window. Stepping outside, they saw a large handprint in the snow. That evening, the entire family gathered in one room, deciding to wait until morning and leave the house. But late at night, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a shadowy figure. Jacob rushed to slam the door shut, but the shadow didn't disappear. It began knocking, softly at first, then louder and louder. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the soldier was sitting on the table before them. Its eyes were now hollow, and its smile had grown wider. On the floor beside it was a message scrawled in ash. "This house is mine now." The family fled the house immediately, leaving all their belongings behind. They never returned. A month later, Jacob found a box of decorations in his room, though no one in the family had brought it home. Inside was the same wooden soldier. Rick was no stranger to loneliness, but on this Christmas Eve, something felt different. The dormitory was almost empty. Most students had gone home, leaving Rick behind with no money and solitude. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows as if trying to break into his tiny room. He sat curled up on his bed, staring at his phone. The evening lights from the window created a cold and muted glow. When the clock struck midnight, Rick glanced at his artificial Christmas tree in the corner. It was decorated with a few colorful ornaments. Not much of a festive sight, but at least it was some trace of Christmas. Suddenly, a faint knock came at the door. Rick blinked, thinking he imagined it. It was too quiet in the dorm, and even the light flickered strangely. He opened the door, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. Only a small red box, carefully placed on the floor. No card, no notes. Just his name, written in black ink on the box. Rick stared at the box for a long time. It was a strange sight, especially in a place where there was no sign of Christmas cheer. The red wrapping seemed too new, too clean. His name, written in elegant handwriting, seemed to imprint itself in his mind. Then he noticed something odd. The lights continued to flash, but now they formed a specific pattern, slowly spelling out a word. Look. Rick froze, his breath quickening. The lights continued to blink, forming strange shapes, as though something, or someone, was trying to make him see something. And every time the word "look" appeared in his vision, Rick felt the air around him grow heavier. His phone suddenly buzzed, an SMS from a friend who had already gone home. Rick flinched, but quickly glanced back at the lights. They flickered faster, and now the word "run" appeared among the lights. Shocked, Rick pushed the lights aside and looked around the room. Panic was rising within him. His gaze fell on the door, which was slightly ajar, and again, as if nothing had happened, there was another box, slightly bigger, sitting in front of him. His stomach tightened with dread. He opened the second box. At the top was a photo taken on film. It showed his room just moments after he had sat down on the bed. But there was one odd detail. Barely visible in the corner of the window, someone's eyes were watching him from behind the curtain. Rick jerked back, his body tensing. He rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain, but outside there was nothing, only snow and a silent courtyard. He scanned the room, looked back at the photo, and his gaze froze on those eyes, the ones that weren't there in real life. He felt a coldness sweep over him. His breathing grew faster, and suddenly, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Rick stood frozen, his nerves on edge. He couldn't stay in the room any longer, but then he noticed a third box had appeared before him. Unable to make sense of what was happening, he opened it. Inside was a small mirror in an antique frame. Engraved on the mirror were the words, "Last Chance." He held the mirror up to his face. Everything seemed normal in the reflection, but something was wrong. He noticed his movements had begun to slow unnervingly. When he raised his hand, the reflection did so with a slight delay, and then the face in the mirror stretched into a grin. Rick recoiled. Suddenly, his reflection began to move independently of him. It was terrifying, as if it wasn't following his actions, but something else was in front of him. Before he could pull away, the mirror cracked. Cracks spread across the glass, and then it started to stretch as though trying to consume him. Before he could pull away, the mirror cracked. Cracks spread across the glass, and then it started to stretch as though trying to consume him. A week later, new students began moving into the dorm. They chatted happily, unpacked their things, and prepared for the holidays. But one of them, Alex, walked into his room and noticed something strange. 3 boxes were lying before the door, identical to the ones that had once arrived for Rick. On the boxes was written Alex's name. The student crouched and began to open them. He opened the first box and found the string of lights. They flickered in the same strange rhythm. As before, the lights formed the word "Look." A chill ran down Alex's spine, and he felt his gaze involuntarily fixate on the boxes. Everything was repeating.